Greetings, I am Mr. O'Neill and I teach English Language Arts online for Stride K12. I also coach chess as well as a few other esports for our online school. And the playoffs just concluded for the K12 Esports League. And in the third, fourth place game, we have Budgie 10, ELO 1844 against Sonic Star 235, ELO 1194. We'll also take a look at the first, second place game after this. It's best 2 out of 3, or really first person to 2 points. So right off the bat, we start with a King's opening, and the response is a Caro-Kann defense. So taking more space in the center of the board right away with d4. Makes sense. Takes. And then knight to f3. Immediately putting a pin right here, but not to worry because there's a pin here as well. Castles, and then e6. Standard, I mean, you could also take here, but just sliding the bishop back is pretty standard because the last thing white wants to do is ruin their pawn structure on the king side. So, and then because this light squared bishop is a good bishop, so it can always slide back and help defend the knight if needed. And this is actually ideal for white because usually the dark squared bishop for white is weaker than the light squared bishop in a lot of positions, so white is happy to exchange its dark squared bishop off, and then vice versa. Usually the dark squared bishop is better for black in most positions, and this light squared bishop is usually a little weaker for black, so white is happy to exchange the dark squared bishops off the board. And this is pretty typical because usually you want your other rook on d1, and then you've got some semi-open files for your rooks to work with. This was a little bit of a peculiar move because instead of taking the pawn, what Sonic Star 235 probably would want to do is just slide the bishop back to b3, and that's also what the engine wants Sonic Star to do as well. But they sack the knight for 2 pawns, and there isn't really any positional value in sacrificing this other than you've got 2 passed pawns that can maybe march down the board and eventually queen, but that's a long-term compensation, not a short-term compensation. So because black is winning material here by a point, then they're happy to start exchanging as much as possible. This is a fork, but not really because the queen can slide back to defend. And then there's more exchanges. And then, yeah, the engine wants this other rook to get into the game. This would have been a better move. And then you also have the rook has X-ray vision on b2. And then the rook is just more active if you move your other rook over. But this still works because b2 is hanging, and there's really no way for white to defend b2. So time to start pushing the pawn. And black does a pretty good job defending here. They gobble up that other pawn, and now they have a passed pawn of their own right here going all the way to d1. And yeah, you can't keep pushing the pawn here because then you're threatened, because black is threatening this. So white had to move the queen over to g3 to defend. And then we have check. Take with check. And then again, the issue with advancing this pawn is they're still threatening this. So for example, if we just pushed the pawn, then this is mate in 2, right? Because this is unstoppable. And then the king's going to go here, and then the queen's going to deliver a checkmate on g2. So still cannot push that pawn. There's just too much pressure. So have to go back. And now white has some issues holding onto the pawn. And this is mate in 12, but I mean, what human is going to see mate in 12? That was forced, by the way, because the king had nowhere to go. So white had to take the knight there. And then it's just a matter of gobbling up the other pawns, and that's game over. And then eventually they just resigned. So Budgie 10 gets the first game. The second game was very interesting. We have a queen's opening this time from Budgie 10. And this king's pawn gambit is known as the England gambit. This is all standard theory. The issue a lot of times with moving your bishop out so early is then you run into this check, which is exactly what happens in the game, and then your bishop is hanging because there's nothing defending your bishop. So you're forced to move the bishop back to defend, but then this pawn is hanging, which is what happens. Although white is still slightly for choice here with correct play. So it's interesting because you could try to start pressuring the queen this way, and then the queen has to go here. And then normally you would think that this would be a strong move, knight to b5, because then you're threatening to take the queen, and then you're also threatening this. But the engine actually prefers the knight on d5 instead of b5, which is tricky and not intuitive at all, because normally you'd want to go after the queen and c7 at the same time. But the reason why the engine likes d5 so much is because if you can get the knight to d5 and there's this exchange like this, and then the queen takes, for example, threatening the rook, well, the white didn't really care about that a2 pawn anyway. The white always wanted to get the rook over to d1 to create this battery. So white has a lot of initiative for the sacrifice, and they're really only down by a point here. So the issue is that, you know, the white's threatening this, so like you could move the king over to try to save it, but I mean, there's just so much initiative here with, you know, this potentially this other knight's going to potentially get in the game to g5, and potentially the knight could even get to e5 if there's ever any pressure on this pawn. So black really has a hard time putting pressure on this pawn, because when this knight takes, there are certain variations where it's just really good for white. I know it looks like the knight reclaiming e5 is bad because this knight's covering, but like, for example, let's say you like try to push the pawn this way. Then you can take, and then takes. Would probably take with the knight first, and then now you've got this knight. Now the knight wants to jump into here, and then you're threatening this. So white's up by 3 full points here. So this is completely winning for white with correct play. And then if you try the other way, it gets even worse. So like if you try this to dislodge the pawn, you can take, and then takes, and then the queen is going to jump into here, and this is 4 points in favor of white, so it's even worse. But lots of crazy positions. You know, white just has a lot of initiative right here in the middle of the board. It just goes to it speaks to how important it is to control the middle of the board, and white is really doing a nice job controlling the middle of the board here. So, but that's not actually what ends up happening in the game. What happens in the game is, yeah, going after the bishop this way, and then, you know, going after this way going after the fork, and then after takes, knight wants to come in. Although, yeah, there's nothing wrong with just going for the fork right away, and the engine prefers this. And then this is, oh, I forgot about that. Yeah, so this is a smothered check. So then the queen has to take, and then you're losing your queen. Yep, that's the only move, and then you're losing your queen. So probably a good move to take, but I guess if you defend this and then take, well, you could take this way. So black is winning by 3 points here, but white is still favored by 1 point. Because black is not castled and the king's vulnerable. And I mean, you could potentially even have queen to a1 to create a double attack this way. And then you're going to just reclaim the knight. So it'll be back to an even position. So yeah, after the knight gets into b4, white says, okay, that knight's dangerous, let's take it. Yeah, did not see the undefended pawn there. Tricky. Really tricky. So sacrificing 2 minor pieces for a pawn and a rook, usually that doesn't work out. Yeah, that pawn was not being defended. But the idea was to dislodge the queen off of a5 so you could get a check. And you can't even bring the rook into the game. I mean, because like normally you'd want to just bring this rook into the game to pin the queen against the king with the rook, but the bishop's defending and then the knight's also defending. So there's none of that. So Sonic Star 235 is in good position to win the game here. So this is where it gets tricky because you want to move the bishop since the bishop is being attacked. But Sonic Star 235 thinks they can attack the queen instead. But the problem with trying to attack the queen first is that now you don't have to worry about your queen immediately because you have an in-between move, pawn takes bishop with check. So pawn takes with check, you have to take this way. It's better to take with the queen, and then this pawn is going down, and then your king is in danger, and Sonic Star is having a lot of issues here. So, because of the pin, for example, the rook pinning the knight against the king. So the king really should should get out of the way of the pin, and then, because like for example, if the king doesn't get out of the way of the pin, then like let's say you're trying to get your queen to a more active square. I mean, you're just going to lose your knight, but I mean, like you could try to. You can't even go after the rook this way because this queen's covering. So you're just in a really tricky spot here. So it just you have to move the king out of the way to get out of this pin because this is a nasty pin. So king moves, and then you're going to create a double attack this way. And you can't actually move the pawn because then you're just losing the pawn on b2, and there's no way to get an extra defender here, so you're going to lose your pawn, and a rook is more powerful than a knight, so Budgie 10 has a winning position here. And what happens in the game is takes, and then take with check is what happened in the game. And then this is a really tricky position. This did not happen in the game, but it's actually best if you use the rook to take the knight because of this really tricky line. Takes. Now you have a ladder fork. Or excuse me, a ladder pin. So check. You have to get out of the check. Check again, and now you're losing your queen. So really tricky position. And then white's completely winning here, obviously. But they didn't quite see that in the game. So what happened in the game was they just moved their queen out to reinforce the rook. And then, again, same principle. You can sacrifice this, like this. Takes. Here, takes, here, takes, here, check, here, and then you just forked the king. Now you're winning the pawn, and this is completely winning. So you got to be really tricky. King goes back, check. King here, check, king here, and then you can just slide they want a perpetual, but you could also slide the queen all the way back this way. Oh, but then yeah, you're getting back rank mated. I forgot about that. So that would be just a perpetual. So you got to be really careful here because of the back rank issues on c1, which they did not see. And then on the next move, Sonic Star didn't miss it and checkmate. So now the third, fourth place game is tied 1-1. This is the game to decide the third, fourth place game since it's tied 1-1. Caro-Kann defense. Sonic Star 235 is taking up plenty of space in the middle of the board right away. Caro-Kann mainline. So yeah, the bishop had to move back because it was being attacked, and then now you've got both knights on this king side along with the bishop, so the king is going to be extra safe. And yeah, this is a fairly common move. You'll notice that the engine was even recommending this because the knight's gonna be protecting the pawn on a4 anyway. And then you can also get some kingside initiative. Assuming black wants to castle on the king side, you could eventually get some initiative by continuing to push this pawn. It's becoming more trendy now to leave your king in the middle of the board, or like once this bishop gets developed to here, or here. It's getting more trendy once the bishop develops to one of those three squares to, instead of castle, just slide the king over to f1. That's kind of a Google AlphaZero move, and a lot of higher level players have been playing that king to f1 instead of castling, because the point is that your king is still fairly safe on f1, and then this rook is staying on h1 to support this pawn that wants to march forward to create some kind of kingside attack. So the bishop has Luft to move back onto h7. Yeah, I think it would be better for black to take here, because now you're ruining white's pawn structure. And then the rook does get a semi-open file, but then it's weakening. So they don't go for that. And white takes the undefended b7 pawn. I mean, if you really wanted to move back, then I guess the better move would be here. Oh, never mind, because the bishop. I forgot about that. So, check, fork. So you have to take because of the fork. And then your queen's not being defended, so you have to exchange queens. And then now you have to take the bishop to even the game back up. Takes, because there's a double attack. Check. White has a lot of initiative here. Castling. Now you're threatening discoveries. That's a decent move, but the issue is that the engine wants this because now the knight's being defended by the pawn, which is a little bit stronger. I mean, this would be coming too, but I mean it's check. King has to move, but then you're getting forked. So, yeah, the knight has some crazy tactics here. So that's the line. That's the reason why the knight to d5 is stronger. So in the game, it was knight to d7, which is weaker. Takes. Now you've got a double attack here. Takes. Take with check. It looks like Sonic Star is going to win the match 2-1 because they're up by 5 points here. And then takes. But the problem with taking that pawn is your bishop is still undefended. It really would have just been better to slide your bishop back to safety because you still have a fork. So the f pawn and the a pawn are being forked right now. So just slide your bishop back, and then the rook could keep hassling the bishop potentially, but then you've got this to protect the bishop. So there's just no good way for black to really make a lot of progress here. This is plus 5.5 for white. So with correct play, completely winning for Sonic Star. But yeah, what happened in the game was they just took the pawn, takes, so they sacrificed their bishop for 2 pawns. But they're still winning by 5 points here. Take another pawn. Now the engine was thinking about this move, and the point is that you're creating a pin of the bishop against the rook, because the more you can exchange down, the more that's going to help you in the long run. So, for example, if you doubled up here like this, then you could play a calm move like pawn to f4, and maybe preparing to get your knight into the game like this. And then, because, I mean, it would be great if you could get your knight on a more active square, like e4. And the bishop has no good discoveries here, because the bishop's on a light square and the king's on a dark square. So the bishop has really no decent discoveries here. So, like, there's just no way for black to make a lot of headway. Like even like sliding the bishop back, just more exchanges are just not going to help you in the long run, because the bishop just has no good attacks being on a light square. Again, the light squared bishops for black are usually not great, and especially if you have a bishop just by itself not being supported by another bishop. The tactics just are not working for the light squared bishop here in this position. So what happens in the game is instead of putting the rook on d1, the rook went to e1, which is not as strong. Taking the undefended pawn, there's a lot of checks. This was almost a perpetual. And the king has some squares to escape to. And you can't take the bishop here because then you're losing your rook. Although it would still be winning for white, technically. But it would not be easy. I mean, you've got all these passed pawns, so like the point is eventually you're going to promote one of these pawns on the king's side, but it's going to take some work. And you also have a passed pawn here. But what happens in the game is now they have, look at this, 6 pawns. They have 6 passed pawns. Sonic Star 235 does. 6 passed pawns. So they should be able to convert this position. Now they only have 5 passed pawns. Now they only have 4 passed pawns. Still should be able to convert this position. Keeping the rooks on the board. Yeah, probably would have been better to just use the knight to block here. Use the knight to block, there's no more checks. Black has problems. The rooks are not coordinating with each other. The bishop is still not coordinating very well with the rooks. The rooks are definitely not coordinating well with each other. So just use the knight to block the check, and then you're good. But instead they move the king. Yeah, this was almost a perpetual again. Yeah, I'm not sure why you would promote to a queen when it's not being supported. Oh, they're really low on time. So they just have a few seconds left. And Budgie 10 just wins on time. So Sonic Star 235 had a winning position, would have won the 3rd, 4th place game, but they lost on time. The championship match, Dr. Evenman 12, ELO 1912, and I Rook Rolled You, ELO 2103. No surprise, these are the 2 best players in the Stride K12 chess world, and King's opening, King's Knight variation, Italian game. And when you're moving the this move bishop to, when you're moving your kingside bishop out to c4, it's like a reverse London almost. Because normally in a London you'd want your dark squared bishop out here on f4. Pretend that this pawn's not there. Normally you'd want your dark squared bishop on f4 in a London, but when you're putting your other bishop on the opposite sided square on the opposite side, it's called the Italian game. And yeah, so probably a good move. I mean, you also could have taken with the knight here, but then the problem is then you're losing this pawn, because right now your knight's the only thing defending that pawn. So taking with the bishop. See, the other issue is if you take with the pawn, then now you're running into this, and your knight has to move. So I mean, it is playable because now you've got a double attack on the pawn, but this bishop can come out to defend, and this is completely playable for both sides. This is just more theory. And then it's also a little bit more complicated. So they don't go into that. So they take with the bishop instead. But then you're losing your bishop pair. So Doctoral Evenman 12 loses his bishop pair in the opening, which is good for I rook rolled you, that they still have their bishop pair. This f4 move is sometimes a little risky because you're opening up your king on this dark squared diagonal, but because black already gave up their dark squared bishop and the queen doesn't really have access to this kind of stuff in the near future, then it's not super risky, and the engine still thinks white's fine here. So I rook rolled you gives up their bishop pair. Yeah, so now you got to be careful because there's a pin and the queen is not being defended. So this pawn cannot actually support this pawn because of the pin against the undefended queen. So they are going to take it. Check. Now this is crazy because you could sacrifice the rook. And the point is if you sacrifice the rook this way, then white has a lot of initiative and you're threatening to get the queen in to g4. So you have to put your rook here to defend g4. And then maybe you want to try to kick the rook away. Well, you got to keep your rook on this rank, because if you get the rook off the rank, then you're getting the queen's coming to g4. So, maybe you want to try to kick the rook again, but then, you're just losing your bishop. So you kind of have to take the rook while you can, and then you're in some trouble here because your king's exposed, and there's this passed pawn on the e file that wants to promote. Like long term, this pawn will eventually promote, and it's going to be supported by this pawn. So see, what happens in the game is they don't go for that. They take the pawn instead, and then this is a nice move for my rook rolled you, because in theory you're got this shish kebab skewer on the diagonal with the bishop, but they can just take the knight, or they can use the knight to take the bishop, I should say. This was a blunder on Doctoral Evenman 12's part because of this tactic. These rooks are really powerful when they're doubled up like this. So would just watch out for that. It would have been better to go rook here. And then, like for example, if you take, and then black's not in check. So black has time to take with checkmate here. So the issue is that it's a race to see who can checkmate the other person first, because there's rooks and queens on the board that are doing a lot of attacking on both sides. So unfortunately, Dr. Evenman 12 did not see this rook to d2 idea to put some extra pressure on this g2 pawn, because the queen has x-ray vision through the rook onto g2, and if the rook and the queen could ever coordinate with each other and work with each other on g2, it would be a deadly combination potentially. And black is actually for choice by 2.5 points here according to the engine, but instead they go for an attack on the queen, but you cannot actually take the queen obviously because of checkmate. That's just checkmate, back rank issues. And then you're kind of forced to having to play queen to c5 according to the engine, which is what happens. But the problem is you're just losing your queen because queens can move backwards. So then it's just a queen rook endgame. It's completely lost. So again, the problem for black is that white is threatening checkmate with the rook or with the queen. So since you're threatening checkmate so many ways, you got to do something about it. I mean, in theory, you could just maybe try to move the rook back, but it's mate in 2 here because after check takes, that's checkmate, right? So, or checkmate, same difference. It's just a really hard position because once you get to this position, there's 3 attackers on f8. And black only ever has 2 defenders at the most on f8. So 3 is always going to be better than 2. It's just a lost position here. And we'll go to the second game. I rookrolled you is winning by 1 game to nothing. I rookrolled you just needs 1 more game to win the championship. And they're playing with the black pieces. So Dr. Evenman 12 needs a win to keep everything alive. And we have a Karo Khan again, this time a fantasy variation. Dr. Evenman 12, I like how they have taken up a lot of space in the middle of the board. It's still technically a 50-50 even game according to the engine, but they have an easier position because they've taken up so much space. But I rookrolled you sees that, and they immediately want to undermine this d4 pawn. Yeah, so you could potentially take this way, but the problem is you're getting forked with the bishop, and you're losing your queen. So that's the reason why you don't want to take with the queen. So now Dr. Evenman 12 had to move his knight all the way back to its starting square, which is worst case scenario. When you're in your opening, you have to move a piece back to its starting square. So that's really bad. And I rookrolled you does a great job finding a lot of best moves here. So bishop getting developed to c5, unleashing this nasty discovered check, and then potentially winning this bishop, and then that'd be almost game over at that point. So you have to move the king to prevent the discovered check. The light squared bishop does a good job acting as a blockade to prevent this pawn from moving. Going for this check. It'd also be mate because the knight would be covering that square. So defending, that's the correct move. And then we just have a mouse slip. Maybe they thought this was a rook, and maybe they thought that you can't take because a rook would be pinning the king here, but it's not a rook, it's a knight, so there's no pin. The only other thing that I could think of was maybe they were trying to, maybe it was a mouse slip and they were trying to sneak their queen into g6, but then you're just losing your knight. So I'm not exactly sure what this mouse slip was about, but that's how the championship game ends for all the marbles, and it's just a queen sack on a mouse slip. And I rickrolled you, won the second game, and won the championship 2-0. And I rickrolled you also won the championship last year. So this is the second year in a row. They may have actually won it 3 years in a row now, but for sure I know they won it last year. So congratulations to I rickrolled you for a repeat championship for the fall season Stride K12 chess championship. And what a season. And good game. Dr. Evenman 12 has nothing to be ashamed of. They're 1912 on chess.com right now. I'm sure Dr. Evenman 12's ELO will get to 2,000 eventually. Their ELO's been going up. It'll keep going up. Once you hit that 2,000 ELO mark on chess.com, you'll just keep going up. So congratulations to Dr. Evenman 12 as well. Nothing to be ashamed of. And lots to learn here. And have a good day, everybody.